Hello.
I made my cheating wife think I was cheating too, handed her divorce papers on Christmas Day, and left. I met Samantha when we were just kids in high school. Back then, she was the girl everyone admired but never dared to approach. I don't know how it happened, but one day, she smiled at me across the cafeteria. That single moment marked the start of a story I thought would be written in forever ink. We were inseparable after that, and by the time we graduated, our plans were already in motion: college together, a house someday, and maybe a family. It all sounded so simple back then. And for a long time, it was. By 22, we were married, standing on the porch of the small house we'd saved for together. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Life was a blur of hard work and big dreams. We faced everything as a team: tight finances, career hurdles, and even losing my father a year after our wedding. Through it all, Samantha was my anchor. I'd like to think I was hers too. When she struggled to find a job, I worked extra hours. When her mother's health declined, I was there to help her through the sleepless nights and hospital visits. We weren't perfect, but we were solid, at least, that's what I believed. Our family grew with time. Caleb was born first, and I can still remember the way Samantha's face lit up when she held him for the first time. 5 years later, we welcomed Luca. They became the center of our lives, and even as I worked long hours to provide for them, I never felt like I was missing out. Our house became a home, filled with laughter, chaos, and the kind of memories you think will carry you through anything. Caleb grew into an independent young man and eventually moved out to live with his girlfriend. Luca, on the other hand, was still navigating those tricky teenage years, and I found myself wondering how I could help him find his path. Through all of it, Samantha was there, my constant partner in every triumph and struggle. Then came the injury. A torn ligament in my knee during a basketball game sidelined me in more ways than one. For months, I was stuck at home, going through physical therapy and adjusting to a slower pace of life. It was during this time that I noticed things shifting. Samantha had always been transparent with me. Her phone would sit on the kitchen counter, her laughter filling the room as she scrolled through memes or chatted with friends. But now, she was quieter. Her phone was always in her pocket or face down on the table. She started coming home later from work, blaming meetings or last-minute deadlines. When I asked her about it, she'd brush it off, her tone sharper than usual. I told myself it was stress. Her job at the marketing firm had become more demanding, and I knew she was under pressure. But the signs were hard to ignore. She spent more time in the gym, something she'd never shown much interest in before. Her wardrobe changed: 2 new dresses, higher heels, and a fragrance I didn't recognize. At first, I was proud of her for taking care of herself. But the longer it went on, the more uneasy I felt. I started to notice the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore, or how she seemed to avoid sitting too close to me on the couch. The tipping point came one lazy Sunday afternoon. I was scrolling through my own social media when I stumbled across a photo of Samantha. She was at a work event, her arm looped through that of a man I'd never seen before. Derek, the caption said, and he was tagged in several other photos from that same evening. He wasn't just standing near her, he was always with her. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder in one shot, on her waist in another. He was younger than her by at least a decade, with the kind of looks you'd expect from someone who spends too much time in front of a mirror. I'd never heard of Derek before. Not once had she mentioned him, despite her tendency to overshare details about her colleagues. It was a small thing, maybe insignificant to someone else, but it planted a seed of doubt that began to grow faster than I could control. I stared at those photos for what felt like hours, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, that it was all innocent. But deep down, I knew better. In the days that followed, I tried to shake the feeling. I wanted to trust her. After all, trust was the foundation of everything we'd built together. But the little things piled up. She'd laugh at her phone and then quickly lock the screen when I walked into the room. Her gym sessions started running longer. And then there was the scent of cologne, a scent I knew wasn't mine, lingering on her clothes one evening when she came home late. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring it. The tension in my chest had grown unbearable, and the questions swirling in my mind refused to settle. I needed answers, but more than that, I needed to know if the life we'd built was still as solid as I'd believed. So I started planning, thinking through every angle of how I'd approach the situation. This wasn't just about catching her in a lie, it was about understanding what had changed and why. Little did I know, the answers I sought would lead me down a path I never could have imagined. After the photos of Samantha and Derek kept replaying in my mind, I realized I couldn't sit back and wait for answers to fall into my lap. I hated the idea of prying into her private life, but the doubt was eating me alive. For the first time in over 2 decades of marriage, I felt like an outsider in my own home, left guessing what secret Samantha might be keeping. It started innocently enough. I noticed her phone left on the kitchen counter one night, its screen lighting up with a notification. My heart raced as I glanced over, but I couldn't bring myself to pick it up. It felt wrong, invasive, and yet, the growing distance between us justified my curiosity in a way I couldn't ignore. That night, I downloaded a program that could sync her phone's messages to my laptop. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, the guilt clawed at me. But I needed the truth more than anything else. The messages didn't take long to appear. At first, they seemed harmless. Conversations with coworkers, chats with her sister, and reminders about upcoming appointments. But then I saw his name, Derek. Their exchange started innocently enough, just a back and forth about a team project. But as I scrolled further, the tone changed. They complimented each other, her on his work ethic, him on her style. Harmless words, but laced with an undertone that felt too personal. The more I read, the worse it got. They talked about late nights at the office, shared inside jokes, and referenced dinners that I'd never heard about. One message from Derek stood out, "Can't stop thinking about last night." Samantha's reply was just as damning, "Me too. I'm counting the days until next time." I slammed the laptop shut, my chest heaving with a mix of anger and despair. My mind replayed every moment we'd shared, every sacrifice I'd made for our family, and now, it all felt like a lie. How could she betray me like this? The woman I'd built a life with, the mother of my children, was living a double life right under my nose. I didn't confront her right away. I wasn't ready, and truthfully, I wasn't sure what I'd even say. Instead, I called Logan, my best friend since college. If anyone could help me make sense of this mess, it was him. Over a few beers, I laid everything out, the photos, the messages, the gut-wrenching feeling that I'd already lost her. Logan listened without interrupting, his face growing more serious with every word I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back and crossed his arms. He told me to slow down. As much as I wanted to confront Samantha, he said it would be smarter to gather more evidence first. Not to hurt her or play games, but to protect myself if things escalated. His advice stung, but he was right. I needed to think clearly and act deliberately, even if every part of me wanted to scream at her for answers. I decided to change my approach. If Samantha was keeping secrets, then so could I. I started leaving the house more often, telling her I had errands or meetings to attend. I changed the passwords on my phone and laptop, something I'd never felt the need to do before. When she asked why I was being so secretive, I brushed it off, saying I just needed some space. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her reaction was subtle at first. She'd glance at me more often, her brows furrowing when I gave short answers to her questions. One evening, as I was heading out, she asked where I was going. I shrugged and said I had some things to take care of. The look on her face was hard to read, but I caught a flicker of something that looked like worry. It was a small victory, knowing that she was starting to feel the same unease I'd been drowning in for weeks. The changes didn't stop there. I started focusing on myself more, hitting the gym and reconnecting with old friends. It wasn't just a tactic to keep her on edge, it was something I needed to do for my own sanity. For too long, I'd centered my entire life around her and the kids, and now, I needed to reclaim a part of myself. Samantha's behavior shifted too. She became quieter, her once confident demeanor giving way to something more cautious. She started checking in with me more often, asking how my day was or if I needed anything. At first, I thought it was guilt, but the more I watched her, the more it felt like fear. She was losing control of the narrative, and it terrified her. One night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, she finally broke the silence. She asked if everything was okay between us, her voice softer than usual. I told her everything was fine, keeping my tone neutral. Her eyes searched mine for any hint of the truth, but I didn't give her the satisfaction. If she wanted to play games, I'd play too. I didn't know where this would lead, but one thing was clear, the dynamic between us had shifted. Samantha wasn't the only one with secrets anymore, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over the situation. Still, the questions lingered. How far had things gone with Derek? And more importantly, how far was I willing to go to uncover the truth? The answers would come in time, but for now, I had to stay one step ahead. If Samantha thought she could keep me in the dark, she was wrong. The game had changed, and I was determined to see it through to the end. The unease and distrust that had settled into my home wasn't enough. I realized that to truly understand Samantha's intentions, I needed to push her further, to see how deep this betrayal ran. Logan's advice was clear: control the narrative. It was time for me to take back the power she thought she held over me. Tina, a close friend of both Logan and me, became part of the plan. She was someone I trusted completely, and when I explained my idea, she didn't hesitate. The goal wasn't to hurt Samantha but to give her a taste of her own medicine, to shake her carefully constructed facade. Together, we orchestrated a photo shoot. Nothing inappropriate, but close enough to spark questions. Tina and I posed in ways that hinted at intimacy, her hand on my shoulder, my arm around her waist, soft smiles that looked too real to be platonic. Logan handled the camera, ensuring the angles and lighting made it all seem believable. When the photos hit social media, the reaction was immediate. Mutual friends and acquaintances flooded the comments with shocked emojis, cheeky remarks, and endless questions. It was exactly the kind of reaction I'd hoped for. Within an hour, Samantha's phone buzzed with notifications. She saw the pictures almost instantly. I knew because the atmosphere in the house changed. Her usual air of composure cracked, replaced by something that looked a lot like panic. Later that evening, she confronted me. She didn't shout or accuse me outright, but her questions came rapid fire. Why hadn't I mentioned seeing Tina? Why hadn't I told her about the photos? I shrugged off her questions with calm indifference, mirroring the same evasiveness she'd shown me for weeks. Her frustration boiled over, and for the first time, I saw real anger in her eyes. That's when I reminded her of the photos with Derek. The words landed like a slap, and she froze, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for an excuse. But I didn't stick around to hear it. Instead, I walked away, leaving her alone with the weight of her guilt. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. I couldn't let myself get complacent, not when the stakes were so high. Every piece of evidence I'd collected, the messages, the photos, the timestamps, was carefully stored. I even went as far as tracking phone records and call durations, anything that could help me later. Samantha, on the other hand, seemed to spiral. Her once steady demeanor gave way to nervous energy. She spent more time on the phone, her conversations with Derek growing shorter and more strained. Whatever fantasy she'd been living in was crumbling, and I was there to watch it happen. Meanwhile, my own behavior continued to shift. I kept up the facade of a man moving on, throwing myself into work, hobbies, and the occasional outing with friends. Tina and I staged a few more spontaneous photos, ensuring they landed exactly where Samantha would see them. Each post seemed to chip away at her confidence. She tried to act unaffected, but the tension between us was palpable. Then came the night she broke. She confronted me again, this time unable to hide the jealousy and fear in her voice. She demanded to know what was happening, why I was pulling away. Her questions came with a desperation I hadn't seen before, but I didn't give her the answers she wanted. Behind the scenes, I took the next step. Logan put me in touch with Jeff, a divorce attorney known for his meticulous attention to detail. Our first meeting was sobering but necessary. Jeff walked me through the process, outlining what I needed to protect myself and my assets. I shared everything I'd gathered, and his expression remained professional but impressed. He assured me I was building a strong case, one that would leave little room for Samantha to manipulate the outcome. As I left Jeff's office, a strange sense of calm washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was moving forward with purpose. Samantha could sense the change too. She watched me more closely, her questions growing bolder, her tone more probing. I gave her nothing, not a single piece of the puzzle she so desperately wanted to solve. Derek's presence in her life seemed to waver as well. I overheard snippets of conversations, arguments muffled behind closed doors. Whatever they had, it was faltering under the pressure. Samantha had played her hand, and now she was scrambling to keep her secrets intact. But I wasn't interested in helping her anymore. This was her mess to clean up, and I had bigger things to focus on. The game was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like I was winning. And as I prepared to take the next steps, I couldn't help but wonder how Samantha would react when she realized just how far I was willing to go to protect myself and my family. Samantha finally broke her silence. The tension between us had reached its breaking point, and one evening she cornered me in the living room. Her voice, usually steady and confident, carried an edge of frustration and fear. She accused me of being distant, of hiding something from her. Her words tumbled out in a mix of anger and desperation as she demanded to know if I was happy in our marriage. I couldn't help it, I laughed. It wasn't a chuckle of amusement but a sharp, bitter sound that seemed to hang in the air between us. Samantha's face fell, confusion and hurt flashing in her eyes. I didn't give her a straight answer. Instead, I offered her a cryptic remark, one that hinted I knew more than she thought. Watching her squirm under the weight of her own guilt gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. She didn't press further, retreating with a tight-lipped expression that told me I'd struck a nerve. In the days that followed, I noticed a shift in her behavior. She began to pull away from Derek. Their messages, once full of flirtation and plans, grew colder and more distant. I saw one where she told him she couldn't risk losing her family. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd already shattered the trust between us, and now she was scrambling to salvage what remained. I couldn't deny the satisfaction I felt watching her world begin to crumble. Derek, however, wasn't as willing to let go. His messages became more persistent, his tone growing increasingly impatient. He pushed her to meet him, to talk things through, but Samantha's replies were hesitant, full of excuses. It was clear their affair was losing its spark under the pressure. I imagined him, frustrated and confused, wondering why she was pulling away. The chaos between them mirrored the turmoil that had taken root in our home. Meanwhile, I continued to play my part. I maintained my distance, focusing on my own life while keeping a close eye on Samantha. The photos with Tina had done their job, planting seeds of doubt and insecurity in her mind. She watched me carefully, her eyes following my every move as if searching for evidence to confirm her suspicions. But I gave her nothing. My calm, detached demeanor only fueled her paranoia. The tension between us reached another peak when she tried to confront me again. This time, her tone was softer, almost pleading. She wanted to know if there was someone else, if I'd found happiness outside our marriage. I sidestepped her questions, offering vague responses that left her more confused than before. The tables had turned, and now it was Samantha who was left questioning everything. Behind the scenes, my preparations continued. Jeff, my attorney, had been working diligently to ensure I was ready for whatever came next. He reviewed every piece of evidence I'd collected, from the text messages to the timestamps of her late-night calls. Each detail strengthened my case, building an unshakable foundation for what was to come. Knowing I had this safety net gave me the confidence to keep pushing forward. Samantha's unraveling didn't stop with Derek. I overheard her on the phone one evening, her voice trembling as she spoke to him. She told him she couldn't keep this up, that the risk was too great. I imagined him on the other end, trying to convince her otherwise, but her resolve seemed firmer now. She was starting to see the cracks in the life she'd tried to build outside our marriage. Despite her efforts to distance herself from Derek, I wasn't about to let her off the hook. I kept gathering evidence, every message and call logged meticulously. Samantha's guilt might have been eating away at her, but I wasn't interested in her remorse. This was about ensuring I had everything I needed to protect myself and my family when the time came. The final twist came when I discovered a series of messages where Samantha discussed ending things with Derek. She told him she needed to focus on her marriage, on repairing the damage she'd done. But it wasn't enough for me. Her words were too little, too late. The damage had been done, and no amount of backtracking could erase the betrayal. The days ahead promised to be difficult, but I was ready. Samantha might have thought she could control the narrative, but she underestimated me. I'd been patient, calculating, and now it was my turn to take the reins completely. Whatever secrets she was still holding on to, I would find them. And when the time came, I would be the one to decide how this story ended. The house was silent as I finalized the last details of my plan. It was Christmas Eve, a night that once symbolized joy and togetherness. This year, it would mark the end of everything Samantha and I had built. I knew the timing was cruel, but I wasn't in the business of preserving her illusions anymore. It was time for the truth to come crashing down. I placed the manila envelope on the dining table, its contents meticulously organized. Inside were the divorce papers, ready for her signature, and a USB drive containing all the evidence I'd gathered, screenshots of messages, photos, timestamps, and even a log of her calls with Derek. Alongside the envelope, I set a small, neatly wrapped box with a bow on top. It looked like any other Christmas gift, but inside was the culmination of weeks of planning. By the time Samantha came home, I was already packed. My suitcases sat by the door, a silent testament to the finality of my decision. She walked in, her expression softening when she saw the holiday decorations. For a moment, I almost felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the lies, the betrayal, and the destruction she'd brought into our lives. Any hesitation vanished. She noticed the envelope first, her eyes narrowing as she approached the table. When she opened it and saw the divorce papers, her face went pale. Her hands trembled as she reached for the USB drive. I didn't stay to watch her reaction. I simply grabbed my bags and walked out, leaving her alone to face the reality she'd created. As I drove to my new apartment, my phone buzzed incessantly. Messages and missed calls from Samantha flooded my screen, but I ignored them. I had nothing left to say. For the first time in months, I felt free. The weight that had been suffocating me was gone, replaced by a sense of clarity and resolve. I knew there was no turning back. The fallout was swift and brutal. Samantha's family received copies of the evidence the next morning. Her parents, who'd always admired me for my patience and dedication, were devastated. Her sisters, once my allies, bombarded her with questions and accusations. The truth spread like wildfire, reaching not just her loved ones but also her workplace. Derek's name came up in the chaos, and it wasn't long before their affair became an open secret. The repercussions for Derek were severe. His company had a strict policy against workplace relationships, especially those involving infidelity. He was called into a meeting with HR and promptly fired. The smug confidence he displayed in his messages evaporated as his world crumbled around him. Knowing he was facing the consequences of his actions brought me a small sense of justice. Meanwhile, Samantha's life unraveled further. Her attempts to explain or justify her behavior only deepened the rift between her and those she cared about. Friends she'd known for years distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. She tried to reach out to me, pleading for a chance to fix things, but I remained resolute. My decision was final. Then came the unexpected. A phone call from Samantha's mother late one evening left me reeling. Samantha had been hospitalized after an apparent attempt to take her own life. The news hit me like a punch to the gut, shaking the resolve I'd built over weeks of planning. Despite everything, I couldn't deny the part of me that still cared, that still remembered the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. I drove to the hospital, my mind racing with questions and doubts. When I arrived, I found her lying in a stark, sterile room, hooked up to machines that monitored her every breath. She looked fragile, a shadow of the person she used to be. Her eyes opened when she heard me enter, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. Neither of us spoke, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between us. As I stood there, I realized that this wasn't the victory I'd imagined. Yes, I'd exposed her lies and ensured she faced the consequences, but at what cost? The woman in that hospital bed wasn't my enemy, she was someone I'd shared a life with, someone I'd once promised to love and protect. The line between justice and revenge had blurred, leaving me questioning my own actions. I stayed for a while, sitting silently by her side. When I finally left, the weight of what had happened settled heavily on my shoulders. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: there were no winners in this story, only survivors trying to piece together what was left. Leaving the hospital that night, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. Seeing Samantha in that vulnerable state had forced me to confront my own emotions. I didn't feel anger anymore, nor did I feel pity. What remained was a quiet realization: I had nothing left to give her. Whatever love I'd felt had been eroded by her lies and betrayal. It was time to focus on what mattered most: my sons and my own future. In the days following Samantha's hospitalization, I made it clear to her family that I wouldn't be stepping back into her life. I kept communication open with her parents for the sake of Luca and Caleb, but I drew firm boundaries. Samantha's recovery was her journey, not mine. My responsibility lay with helping my boys heal from the fallout of her actions. Luca, in particular, struggled with the weight of what had happened. At 17, he'd idolized his mother, and discovering her infidelity had shaken him deeply. I spent hours with him, talking through his feelings, reassuring him that her mistakes didn't define his worth or the love she had for him. Caleb, always the pragmatic one, stepped up in ways I hadn't expected. He encouraged his younger brother to stay with me, reminding him that we'd get through this as a family. Watching my sons support each other was a bittersweet reminder of what Samantha and I had once hoped to build. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself reconnecting with old friends. One of them was Rachel, someone I hadn't spoken to in years but who had always been a steady presence in the background of my life. She reached out after hearing about the divorce, offering a kind word and a listening ear. What started as casual conversations over coffee quickly evolved into something deeper. Rachel's empathy and warmth were a stark contrast to the chaos I'd left behind. She didn't judge me for my decisions or push me to move faster than I was ready. Instead, she gave me the space to process everything at my own pace. One evening, as we walked along a quiet park trail, Rachel admitted that she'd always had feelings for me. Her words caught me off guard, but they also sparked something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. For the first time since my world had fallen apart, I allowed myself to consider the possibility of happiness. Rachel and I agreed to take things slowly, letting our relationship develop naturally. It wasn't about filling a void left by Samantha, it was about starting fresh, building something genuine from the ground up. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings moved forward smoothly. Samantha, perhaps out of guilt or exhaustion, didn't contest the terms. We divided our assets without much conflict, and I retained custody of Luca until he turned 18. Caleb continued living independently but stayed in close contact, often dropping by for dinner or family movie nights. The simplicity of those moments reminded me of what I'd been missing: a life free from deception and uncertainty. As my relationship with Rachel deepened, I noticed a shift in myself. The anger and bitterness that had once consumed me began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to embrace the life ahead. Rachel became not just a partner but a source of strength, someone who reminded me of the man I wanted to be. She encouraged me to pursue new hobbies, to travel, and to invest in my own happiness. Her presence was a balm to wounds I hadn't realized were still raw. The final step in letting go came on a sunny afternoon in late spring. I stood in the backyard of my new home, surrounded by laughter as Luca and Caleb helped me set up a barbecue. Rachel was there too, her smile as warm as the sunlight filtering through the trees. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. The shadows of the past no longer loomed over me, they were just memories, distant and powerless. Samantha's attempt to reach out continued sporadically, but I remained firm in my decision. I wished her well from afar, hoping she'd find her own path to healing. But my life was no longer intertwined with hers. The chapter we'd shared had ended, and a new one had begun. Starting over wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I'd learned the importance of resilience, of finding strength in the face of heartbreak. More importantly, I'd rediscovered the value of authenticity, in my relationships, in my choices, and in myself. As Rachel's hand slipped into mine that day, I knew one thing for certain: I was finally free.
Bye bye.